Right, are we ready? Great. Good afternoon, everybody. I have a whole sweep of an audience here, so thank you all very much for coming out. Thank you to our virtual audience. We are here to talk to half of Michael Stanley, the guy known as Stan Trollope, about their new book, A Deadly Covenant. So do you want to explain why Michael Sears is not here?
Yeah, I mean, he's probably watching. I hope he's watching.
Hi, Michael.
Unfortunately, had a health problem a couple of months ago and was advised very sternly by his doctor not to get on an aeroplane for 22 hours to come here and to a variety of other events. So I'm left holding the fort, and he's probably sitting back there with a nice glass of wine watching.
He should be if he's in South Africa, because the wine, we discovered a wine when we were in, I never can pronounce this right, Franschhoek?
Franschhoek, yeah.
Okay.
French Corner.
Yep. Oh, right, exactly.
From the Huguenots.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
And it was a rosé, and I'm not particularly fond of rosés because I think they can be very sweet, but this one was absolutely perfect. So we now import it, my husband and I, and we absolutely love it.
And do you remember the vineyard?
If, you know, I have more senior moments than I wish to. I will come up with the name of it as we talk along. Good. One of the things I have proved is that you actually don't forget things when you get old. It's just your retrieval system bogs down. And it takes, because if I'd forgotten it, I could never like dredge it up again. But eventually it will pop out.
Usually at 3 in the morning.
No, hopefully while we're here, because it's so good. Usually Patrick, when we were doing virtual events, you're familiar with Patrick if you shop here. Patrick does the tech, and there's a chat feature, and when he sees me going, he types in whatever I'm trying to remember on the chat feature, so he saves me from being an idiot. Right, so anyway, this series has a long, interesting, and extremely complicated publishing history.
Yes.
I know, and I'm hoping, because this book is a product of a new venture called White Sun Books, which I am assuming that you and Michael actually have some control over.
And also Anna Maria Alfieri, who writes some wonderful books in South America and East Africa. So yes, we're sort of basically it, and have picked up a number of other books that have sort of fallen by the wayside, in effect. And really why we pushed this one through White Sun was to try and get it released for BoucherCon. And
Right.
It sort of came out right at BoucherCon. Otherwise, through a traditional publisher, we would have struggled.
So tell us about White Sun. This is interesting because if any of you have been paying attention to the publishing scene, when I started the store, there were 40 or 50 suppliers, and now there are 5 of the major publishers. And if Penguin Random House follows up Simon & Schuster, there's only going to be 4, which really limits the number of books and the number of authors that can get published. The good side of it is, as they kind of move themselves into that realm, they're opening up a way for a lot of small presses. And we're beginning to see some. Blackstone, for example, is a really good small press. Zando was another one that just came along. So, you know, capitalism in action. But I'm pleased to see White Sun, but tell us more about it.
Yeah, it started off actually in Iceland. Yeah.
Of course, White Sun.
Why not White Sun? Well, it's actually maybe a little different from what you expect. My friend Anna Maria Alfieri, that's her pen name. She writes as that's what she writes as. Her name's Patricia King, out of New York. We were both at Iceland Noir a few years ago, probably 4 or 5 years ago now, and we were sort of getting a little teed off that all these Nordic writers were saying how they were the writers of the moment, and they were so proud and sort of boasting about all their writing. And we know them all.
So.
And absolutely, they're very good writers. But those of us who don't write in the Nordic areas, you know, started getting a little antsy about this. And so Patricia and I said, well, we should push back on this. You know, all this Nordic noir. I mean, how can you kill somebody when you're dressed in 16 layers of clothes and so on? It's hot areas that really where murders and anger take place. So we curated a book of short stories which we called Sunshine Noir, as obviously cocking a snoot at the Nordic Noir. And we had 17 very good writers write short stories for that book, which we then published as White Sun books. And we were delighted. 2 of them were finalists for Short Story Dagger in the CWA. And so that was our sort of first little venture in getting something published. And we did I did pretty much all the work from the technology side and so on. And then we thought, well, why not? And then we had a real hassle with Macmillan, who was publishing our books 5 and 6. They said, we're going to just publish a hardcover. So we said, well, why not a paperback? And they said, we sell so many hardcovers into libraries, we don't need a paperback. And this was right around the big recession of 2010-11. And they sold very few hardcovers into the libraries. And then they said, you see, you're not selling many hardcovers, so we're not going to publish any paperbacks. And that, if you look at our sales, there's a step function. You know, first 4 books were decent for 5 and 6. And after a lot of wrangling and arm twisting, we actually persuaded them to give us our rights back, which was a real surprise because they're not known for being generous in that respect. And so we said, well, why not use the imprint White Sun Press to reissue those as paperbacks, which we've done.
Which I'm really glad about. And briefly, Poison Pen Press published 2. But then we sold Poison Pen Press to another company, and they were discouraged by sales. So the long and short of it is that they are much better off with these wonderful books to be doing this with White Sun Press, because otherwise you're just subject to the vagaries of big publishers, and the sales that they need to sustain their business models are so high that not many authors can really meet them anymore. So I'm really delighted.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
One of our titles was a standalone thriller called Shoot the Bastards, which I loved. And then one of them, did I bring it over here? No, it's probably still up on the desk, was Facets of Death.
Yeah.
Right.
It was right down there.
There it is.
Yeah.
And that's the one I really, which is a prequel to Detective Kubu, who is a wonderful character. And this one is where you actually have him arriving for his first day of work.
Correct. Yeah. It's an interesting story because when we started writing, which we put the first finger to keys.
I'm going to be right back. I have to turn off the buzzer.
In 2003, and finished it 3 years later, and it was eventually picked up and first published in 2008. We were told that we should always write what you know. And so in our drafts and in that first book, as we were sort of getting going, the book starts with a game ranger and a professor of ecology. Michael and I are both professors, or were both professors, finding a body that's being consumed by a hyena. And so the professor of ecology was going to be the main character. However, it was very clear that this body had been murdered, and the hyena was the disposal system, because hyenas eat both the flesh and the bones. And of course, once you think it's a murder, you have to get a policeman along. And we sent Detective David Bengu from Gaborone into the middle of the Kalahari to be the detective. And literally, by the time he arrived, he had taken over as the main character. We never had any intention of him being our main character. And which was terrific because people like him and we like him. So we wrote 6 books with him as an assistant superintendent, already a senior detective. And then we sort of realized we didn't know very much about him as a young man. So we said, why not write a prequel? And so we had a lot of fun going back to his first day when he's now a detective sergeant. He's, low on the totem pole, the Botswana totem pole. And that became the Facets of Death. And then this is a second in the prequel series, if you like, and takes place just a few months after he gets into in the criminal investigation department.
This kind of thing happens with any long-running series. And the reason it often happens is that whoever started the series, in this case, Stanley and Michael, they just picked an arbitrary time and an arbitrary age, right? And then it goes from there. But my experiences with almost all long-running series, at some point people want to know about the before, and by then there's been enough said about the character, and the character has filled out to the point where there can be an interesting past. It wouldn't be if you tried to do it too early. Michael Connelly did it at book 5. He did 4 Harry Bosch books, and then he decided that he would stop Harry investigating his mother's death, the whole bit, and start a whole new thing. In his case, not a prequel. Charles Finch actually wrote 3 prequels. He did a prequel trilogy for the Charles Lennox series. He'd written, I can't even remember, it must have been, what do you think, Kathy, a dozen? Remember? Like at least a dozen. Victorian Detective, wonderful series. And it was interesting because, and it's true in this book, in Facets of Death, because Kubu meets the woman who becomes his wife. But you see him stumbling through his courtship in the first one, and he's still kind of doing it in this one because he can't quite believe that she would be interested in
Correct, because he's a very large man. Kubu is the Setswana word for hippopotamus, and it was a school friend of his who called him that, but as a term of affection, not as a term of bullying.
Not fat shaming.
Sorry?
He was not being
He wasn't being fat shamed. Yeah. Kubu thought he was being fat shamed because of his size, and he had had a tough time in primary school being bullied and shamed, along with a young Bushman friend of his. So both of them, one big and fat and the other one thin and small, became good friends. And that's a theme that has played its way out through a lot of our books.
I really like the name of his now wife, but when we meet her first in Facets of Death, is she working in the police department?
In the records department,
right. Yeah. And her name is Joy, which I think is a lovely name for her. And then in this one, despite all the other things that are going on, Kubu finds a little time to spend with her, and she's friendlier than he expects. And so it looks all good. Now, you could actually write a third. You could have a trilogy.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that makes sense in terms of where the story's going. Mm-hmm. There needs to be another bridge between the prequel and the original ones.
Once an editor, always an editor. Yeah. 2 books, so now I can't stand it. Well, and actually, since White Sun Books probably doesn't provide you, or does it, with an editor?
No, this one we were very fortunate. We hired one for another book, for one that I wrote myself called Wolfman.
Okay.
But for this one, we were able to get our UK publisher to edit it, because in fact, today is the first day that A Deadly Covenant spreads its wings around the world. It's the first day of publication for the ebook around the world.
Very exciting.
Yeah,
and
thank you. And the paperback will come out in the rest of the world in early December, and the audiobook in early November. So we were able to get them to do all the editing, which was terrific. And so we were able to avoid that expense and so on. But you have to get a professional editor to work on these. It's not worth doing it yourself.
A lot of work, right? I can speak for them, and I miss it, so we can talk. But anyway, let's talk about Bushman, because I thought your previous book, which one is it, where there's a whole thing going on with the Bushmen?
This one here, The Death of the Mantis.
Okay. I thought it was a tremendously powerful book.
Thank you.
There's not much written where the Bushmen, have any of you read Death of a Mantis? I mean, amazing, right? Mm-hmm.
Section especially with a lot of background.
But you don't let it slow the story down. It's not like there's a big chunk of.
Yeah, one of the things that is we have to keep in mind, both being professors, is that we talk a lot and we like to do a lot of research. Yeah, but you can't do too much of that in a book that's meant to hold people's attention and be a mystery and so on. So what we've always tried to do is know a great deal about the backstories that we write about. And each one of our books has a current backstory that affects Botswana and Southern Africa in general. And then lay the mystery on top of that without being preachy, hopefully, and so on and so forth. And both Michael and I have been very interested in Bushmen for a long time because, like the Aboriginal peoples in Australia and the Native American people here, they have been hugely marginalized. And it's horrific in many ways. The last license to hunt a Bushman was issued in the 1930s.
Hunting like game?
Yeah. Oh, Mr. Clark, I'll have a license for, how about 2 kudu, 1 Bushman, and 3 springbok? That's 1936. That's 85 years ago.
Yeah. Of course, the Kalahari is the southern Kalahari area of Botswana is where they live, right?
Right. They live northern South Africa, Kalahari, and the northern, and they have been marginalized ever since other people came there. And the Bushmen are probably the oldest living group on the planet. And there's
even older than the Australian?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Because that's something like 56,000 years old.
Yeah, the DNA tends to show that originally comes from northern Namibia, northwest Botswana. Yeah.
Well, they're small. This is actually kind of a nice depiction here on Death of Mantis.
Yeah, very small, yellow, not white, not black. And like so many other people of that ilk, they don't believe in ownership in the same way that we do. They believe that the earth belongs to everybody. When they go out, because in the nomadic Bushmen, or the sand people, when they go out, they tend to be in very small groups, 10 to 15, because of the harsh climate. You can't have a big group nomadic in a desert. And whenever they went somewhere and found water, for example, they would leave a lot of the water, even if they were still thirsty, because they knew a time would come when they needed water, and if the group that had been there before had taken it all, they would die. So very, very generous. I mean, it's a survival skill, but very sort of generous. And the problems occurred when the black groups came from the north and the whites came from the south and started owning land and owning cattle. And the Bushmen, being nomadic hunters, probably came across a cow somewhere and said, my goodness, this cow's not going to run away. So why don't I just kill it, and right here, I don't have to shoot it with my special poisoned arrow and so on and run after it for 3 days, which you would have to do for an eland or something. But of course, whoever owned that cow didn't see it in the same way. The Bushman said, this is for everybody, and the owner said, oh no. And the Bushman would be killed or enslaved. And that just happened more and more and drove the Bushmen deeper and deeper into the Kalahari. And
well, it's the same process that happened here in this country,
right.
or in Canada, or in Australia.
Yep,
identical. When new people came in and pushed the native first, what is the Canadians call them first?
The Bushmen call themselves the first people, and I think they do also in Canada. Or the First Nation. First Nation, right. Yeah.
And, Australians still call them Aboriginals. We call them Native Americans or Indians. It's happened. And because they were all nomadic, the whole European concept of ownership or other civilization ran full tilt into them.
Absolutely.
But the Bushmen are, physiologically and psychologically adapted to the desert. And so they can survive in ways that, not Bushmen can't possibly survive.
And I suspect there are few, if any, truly nomadic Bushmen left now, for a variety of reasons. There was a big clash between the Botswana government and the nomadic Bushmen a number of years ago. The government said the Constitution requires us to provide health and education to everybody in the country, all citizens. Very difficult to do that to nomads. So they said, you've got to get out of the central Kalahari and settle down in a little town called New Hade, which is a very sad place. And the Bushmen said, oh no, traditionally we've been nomadic. And a human rights group called Dishwanelo challenged the government and won. So, of course, you really never win against the bureaucracy. And so the Bushmen were allowed to stay there, but then the government started providing more things at New Hade and no water in the Kalahari, and so suddenly it became a little easier and more comfortable for people to be near the water and so on. And Michael and I have been to New Hade, and it's very, very sad. It's like a lot of other places in Australia and this part of the world where those people have now settled, and it's very discouraging.
Where you also see it is up north along the Arctic, where the Eskimo, various kinds, the native people up there, their civilization, the way they've been living, is collapsing because the sea ice is eroding, and there's less in the way of game for them to live on. The polar bears are vanishing, the seals, the whole bit. And so a lot of people around the world who are adapted to different climates are losing out now because, and I think about that. Did any of you watch Shetland, the Anne Cleves series on television?
Sure,
based on her? It's a wonderful series. I can really recommend it. These people are living at sea level on Scottish islands, and it's only going to take like a 1 foot rise when the Greenland ice cap goes to wipe them out. Also true in Florida, I might add, or even, Manhattan. People are just, can't resist living like practically on the margin, the beach. But it's not going to take a lot.
Either on the margin on the beach or in the middle of dry forests.
I mean, we're facing a water problem here in Phoenix, so we may find ourselves closer to the Kalahari than we had actually anticipated. Although it's been really rainy this fall, apparently not sufficiently so to help. Why don't we talk about what the actual story is now that we've talked all around it? Because this is a story that engages Kubu with Bushman, and it's a very sad story.
Yeah. The story starts off with the operator of a backhoe. He's digging a pipeline from the Okavango River, which is really the only consistent water in Botswana up in the north. It feeds into the Okavango Delta, which is the most amazing place on earth, in my opinion. Absolutely astonishing. And they want, this little village wants to divert the water into some potentially farming areas. And so there's a backhoe operator digging this trench, and suddenly he notices sticking out of the sand of his, the bucket of the backhoe, a skull. And of course, that's sort of a little bad news for him. He's paid by the hour. So he has to go and investigate, and because he doesn't know the difference between a human skull and a baboon skull. And there are plenty of baboons in that area along the river. So he's sort of in two minds about what to do. If he stops work, he's not going to get paid. And he goes and looks in the trench itself now, and there are a whole bunch more bones there. So he decides he has to report it. To cut through part of the story, the forensic pathologist in Gaborone is sent up to this area, and Kubu's boss says, you go along with him just to see how this is done. He doesn't expect it to be anything, because skeletons are, for a body to be a skeleton, it has to have been around a very long time. And so they expect this is something that's probably 50, 100, 150 years old. And Kubu's just going to learn a little bit about how you excavate this. When they get there, it turns out that there are 9 skeletons, and they're all of Bushmen, men, women, and kids, and they've all been murdered. So even though there's no way of assessing when the crime happened, it becomes a much more serious investigation.
Well, let me pause and say
Yeah.
that there's no statute of limitation on murder. Other crimes at some point can no longer be prosecuted, but murder has no end game. So as long as they found them, and even if they'd been 100 years old, it just would have been like a super cold case, but the police would have been obliged to investigate it.
Right. Then 2 things happen. One is one of the senior counselors of the village is murdered. And there seems to be absolutely no reason why that should happen, because he's well respected, well known, and of course the police never think these are coincidences, so that gets their attention. And then there is two other things. One is, out of nowhere, a Bushman man comes to the site of where the skeletons had been excavated and provides very strange messages to Kubu and the pathologist and the police, saying that the ancestors are very happy that the family has been found. And of course, nobody really knows what that means. And Salelo is the name of the Bushman. He says, he seems very confused. And of course, language is a huge issue because he's not fluent in either Setswana or in English. He says, sting like a bee. People, they're saying, what does that mean? And so he arrives at this and performs a trance dance. And Bushmen do that. They dance themselves out of their bodies, essentially. And from his perspective, he has this dance and he leaves his body and goes to the ancestors and says, I've found the family. And they were happy that he's found the family. And then he returns to his body. And they puzzled, how did this guy know that they'd found these things? I mean, it's not from the area. He lives at the birthplace of humankind at Sodillo Hills, which is 100 or so kilometers away. So, that's all very puzzling. And then there's another senior person in the village who is a woman, and people there sort of think she's a little batty because she's always saying that the water spirit, Mami Wata, is telling her things and guiding how things are. And she says, Mami Wata told us that there were going to be problems if we dug this trench. You can't take her water. And then she is found dead, ostensibly eaten by a crocodile. So that's sort of,
I'd stop there.
yeah, that's where I was going to stop.
One murder too far.
Yeah.
There we are. It's fascinating. That trance dance thing is what we call the whirling dervish, but I've actually in Istanbul been down. It's in the old. They now dance in the old Orient Express train station in Istanbul, but it's the same thing. So it's not, without precedent that people
Correct.
wear themselves out physically in the whole bit and enter into some kind of a trance or other state where they.
Yeah, and absolutely. And they believe, the Bushmen believe that they are leaving their body and are
Right.
communing with, and the stars are the ancestors. And there's this lovely phrase that we've read, that the ancestors were so close you could hear them whisper. And yeah, and in the Kalahari with the Milky Way, the stars are just absolutely astonishing.
also been shown that, people, oracles and seers and so forth in ancient times, everybody goes, how did they know? There were plenty of drugs. In fact, the Delphi oracle, they've shown that there's a vent in the earth where, I'm trying to remember what it is, the steam is
Probably sulfuric.
sulfur.
Yeah.
It's actually a sulfur vent, and so the women who were the oracles of Delphi were probably just stoned. And we think that like we have the monopoly on drugs, or that they're a recent thing, but psychedelics and drugs are just as old
And I'm
as
sure
the world.
I'm sure that's very much part of the Bushman culture too.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's not any different than peyote here for natives and so forth. Or in South America, actually, when you go to Peru, if you go up to Cusco in order at that elevation, they actually give you coca tea in the lobby and coca leaves, because the cocaine will rev up your system so that you can breathe, because the altitude change is so hard on your body. So, it's,
Yeah, absolutely.
right. So I think that you have to think about the bush. I mean, if I were out in the desert with no water and it was 120 and all, I'd be really pleased to be stoned, right? Wouldn't you? So it might be, it's sort of, I mean, really, maybe part of the, who knows what all plants and so forth, they've learned to ingest. That's one of the tragedies of the Amazon being so raped, is that there are undoubtedly plants and things there that, would be helpful to current civilization, but they're going to vanish before we ever figure them out.
Well, that in a sense is the backstory of not here, Dying to Live, and again, a Bushman is found dead lying next to a dirt road in the middle of the desert. And at first, the police think he's just died of old age because he's wizened and grey-haired and so on. But the constable notices that there are contusions, etc., on his body. So they have to send his body in for an autopsy. And when the pathologist, Ian MacGregor from Scotland, opens him up, inside this old body, he finds the internal organs of a young man. And not only that, he finds a bullet embedded in one of the abdominal muscles, and there is no entry wound. And so suddenly people think this Bushman had found a plant that prolongs life. And you can imagine the greed around a discovery of that nature. And that's really the backstory of Dying to Live.
So you and Michael have had a really wonderful time as you worked your way through this series, teaching us about the culture and things that we wouldn't necessarily know.
Thank you.
You both are in South Africa,
Right.
and have been there. I've actually been there too, but not to the middle of the Kalahari. I wasn't quite brave enough for that. But Namibia.
Yeah, well, it's very similar. But yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why we're very happy we decided to write in Botswana as opposed to South Africa was, if you write in mysteries in South Africa, you're really shackled at some level to the aftermath of apartheid. And there are lots of good writers who do that. And we thought, there's so many more interesting things in Southern Africa that nobody's really talking about. So why not go there and use these other interesting backstories for that?
There are some wonderful South African writers. They tend to be noirish,
Right.
And often urban, Cape Town and so forth. Cape Town, I have to tell you, to me, is just like going to San Diego. I mean, I could hardly believe it. I was in Cape Town.
Much more beautiful, though.
I said to Rob, we're in San Diego.
Same latitude,
Yeah,
except flipped.
very, very, very simple.
Yeah,
All the way around, except San Diego doesn't have those great little penguins.
that's
I
true.
love the burrowing penguins. So in all different southern parts of the world. I've been to visit them in Melbourne, and in New Zealand, and in Patagonia. We just had an Argentinian author here in the store shopping, and we were talking about the little penguins in Patagonia, but they also exist south of Cape Town. And so if you go down, Cape Town is actually not on the Cape, so you
Right.
have to drive down there, which is really cool because that's where the Indian Ocean and the South, it all comes together. It's really exciting to stand there and look at it. But that's where these little penguins, little burrowing
But
penguins
talking
are.
about penguins and talking about Bushmen, Sodillo Hills, which plays a role in this book and in a number of other books, the birthplace of humankind from the Bushman perspective. It's a place of more than 3,500 rock paintings, some of which extend back thousands of years.
Even better than Lascaux, huh?
Very different. I mean, huge numbers of them, and a lot of them in just still pristine condition because of the dry climate. But two, I've always sort of really gone back. Every time I go there, I go back and sort of gaze at these because they astonish me. And they are of penguin and a whale. And Sodillo Hills is probably 300 or 400 kilometers from the Atlantic Ocean as the crow flies. And so how? I mean, I can easily see how the Bushmen could find the Atlantic. Okay, you just go west and you'd hit the Atlantic somewhere. But how do you find your way back? Because it's much more difficult. And here you are hundreds and hundreds of miles from the ocean and quite much further north than Cape Town. And here are pictures of penguins and whales. Just amazing. Yeah.
Those little penguins have been there for a really long time. They're so adorable.
Yeah.
Right. Did any of you watch, what's the name of the movie? Remember that had, I can't think of it right offhand, but there were penguins and they had the rockhopper penguins, the ones with the crazy heads. And you find those in the Falklands. I can remember going there with my kids and they made us drive all the way from Port Stanley to the other side of the island to see the rockhopper penguins because they just are demented looking.
Yeah. When I grew up, the ones in Cape Town and up to all the west coast, up to Namibia, in fact, were called jackass penguins because of the noise they made. But now they've, political correctness, they've renamed those African penguins.
So let's talk a little bit about the bureaucracy of the police force because it's almost impossible for anybody to write a police novel where you don't wind up, because there is a chain of command. Police forces are really paramilitary organizations with chains of command. Otherwise, without that, they would be hard-pressed to function. But as a result, you can always add conflict into almost any story of a cop, just interacting with either his superiors or fellow cops, or cops underneath him, is the case.
Right. And in a sense, in this case, there's less conflict than there is in a couple of our other books because Kubu is a newbie, so he's going to keep as low a profile as he can.
But when he came in Facets of Death, they really resented him, and he ran into a lot of office politics in Facets of Death because there was some thought that he had like special favor. I'm trying to remember, is he related to?
No, what happened with Facets of Death is he had done so well at university, and he had sort of interned a little bit for Mabaku, that they moved him straight from graduating at university into a detective sergeant in a criminal investigation department. And all the other cops there, all the other detectives had to ply the beat and do that for years before they could even make it in. And so instantly he was resented. And he was smart.
Yeah, that happens in British a lot, where somebody from Oxford, actually, one of the reasons that people like Lord Peter Wimsey were not formally in the police force is that the cops would never have put up with Lord Peter in a million years, I mean, so, and since he had independent income and a handy brother-in-law actually on the force, and, that's another thing you have to do if you're not having official policemen, like private eyes and amateur sleuths and all. They have to have somebody who's an actual cop in order to be able to arrest anybody. So there are oftentimes personal relationships, like Lord Peter and his brother-in-law.
Yeah, we had a very interesting thing happen.
Sherlock Holmes and Inspector Lestrade.
That's right.
Yeah.
We had a very interesting thing happen to us before our first book was published. I had been trying very hard to get an interview with the director of the CID in Botswana, and I never got any response. So Michael and I went there because we wanted to do some in situ research, and I kept calling this guy, and eventually he said, "You've worn me out." He said, and then we were in a hotel in Gaborone, and he said, I'll meet you tomorrow, it was a Saturday at noon, I can't remember the exact time, and I'll take you around and you can ask me questions. And we actually spent the whole of the rest of the day with the director of the CID, and he was fantastic. Not only did he take us all over the place, showing us where different things had happened, but one of the things that really was very influential in us writing the fourth book, Deadly Harvest, was he said, you know, we have in this town things called Mooty murders. It's all through sub-Saharan Africa. And Mooty is a word for medicine. So when I grew up, my mother said, don't take your Mooty. Just, that's what you do. But a Mooty murder is a murder committed by a witch doctor for human body parts to make a magic potion to remedy something that somebody usually doesn't have. So if a woman is infertile and has a lot of money, she'll go to a witch doctor and ask for a remedy, and the witch doctor will go and find a very attractive young girl, murder her, extract the body parts and make a magic potion. And the director said, you need to write about this because we never solve any of those. And we don't solve them because the perpetrator, the witch doctor, and the victim have no connection. And almost all murders have a connection. Secondly, the police are scared to get on the wrong side of the witch doctor. And thirdly, the person who has paid the witch doctor is rich and influential, so they never get caught. And so A Deadly Harvest is based on a real case, which happened in the 1990s. A young girl called Segametsi Mokhomotsi was killed. And the story goes on a little bit longer because the police, of course, didn't want to do anything. And the locals, this little town called Machudi, north of Gaborone, started protesting about the lack of police involvement. And the government, and some people were killed in the protests. And eventually the government said, all right, we'll take care of this. And they called in Scotland Yard, because it had been a British protectorate at one stage. There was a relationship with Scotland Yard. And Scotland Yard personnel came out and investigated and wrote a report, which has yet to be published. So guess what's in that report? Some powerful person.
Every level. It
Yeah.
really does.
Yeah.
It's terrible. Oh, well, tell us what you're planning for the next book, then we'll take questions.
Actually, nothing is planned at the moment. I have some ideas because it needs to bridge where we are with a carrion death.
Okay.
So he needs to get married.
Okay.
Needs to have a kid.
Okay.
He needs to do something really interesting to get promoted.
Wow, you have time for maybe a quartet, quartet prequel. Why not? You know,
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's really fascinating. And if you read the books where he's matured and all, I think it's really fun to go back and see how he got there. Are you all enjoy prequels? You know, learning more about the character. I find them fascinating.
But it was fun from us. We had to, you know, because we didn't know anything. We had to make sure what we wrote
Right.
fitted the six books that had already gone.
Well, that's so true. I mean, once you've written it, you can't take it back.
Correct.
So, indeed, that is a problem. But
Yeah.
but I think watching Kubu and Joy marry and have a family as part of all this, bringing us up to the point where they were when we first met them,
Right.
would be really good. And now that you have control of all the books.
Yeah. What we really want now is to try and get control of all the books. We would love to get all the HarperCollins books back.
Because this one, wherever it was, this is a HarperCollins book, right?
The first four were HarperCollins.
Right.
This, and the second death of Good Luck Tanubu was. So those four are still controlled by HarperCollins.
Okay.
And we,
Then Facets of Death is still controlled by,
by source books, and
right.
we're trying to get that back. And
They're
'cause-
pretty good about letting stuff go, so you
Yeah.
should probably be all right there.
Yeah.
But it would be great if, all of it comes back together. I'm always sad when, a customer comes in and reads a book that's available and then wants to go back and, read the earlier books, and we can't supply them because increasingly, sadly, those books stay out of print. Publishers have decided that they can keep the rights by publishing them in digital form, or, this is true, Stephen Saylor, for example, is a fabulous author, wrote this great Roman series. When he was here for his final, because he's been here for the whole series, won awards, all things great. I went to order his backlist. They were $29.99 in a print-on-demand paperback from his publisher. Now, who's going to buy a $30 paperback?
Yeah.
Heck, they cost more than the new hardcover. But it's a
yeah.
cheap way of keeping the rights so they can do digital books is really what it comes down to.
So the good thing about White Sun Press is that we not only have them through Amazon, of course, but we also make them available through Ingram, so that
which is where bookstores buy them.
where bookstores buy it, and we want to continue that. I mean, there are some downsides to that from our perspective, but the upsides are greater than the downsides, and so we want bookstores to be able to access all of our books.
Any of you have questions that you'd like to ask, Kathy?
Just one of the things that I enjoyed so much about Deadly Covenant is that in the later books, we basically saw Mabaku. His major function seemed to be complaining about something.
Well, he was the director.
But in a Deadly Covenant, you get to see him as Kubu's mentor and
Right.
showing him how things should be done. I really enjoyed seeing that other side.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, we felt that was really important because Kubu had to get to be the assistant superintendent, and you don't do that by yourself. You need guidance all the way.
Anybody else? Any of you have a question? Comment?
How long have you lived in that area?
Well, I was born and raised there, and Michael was born and raised in South Africa. And Michael still lives there, and I spend about half my time in Cape Town, and then I don't know how many times we've been to Botswana, probably 15, 20 times. And when we're of the belief that you should go to the places that you write about.
Yes, you can tell. I mean,
And it's often not just
they're neighboring countries, so it's not like they're going to North Africa up to Morocco or something.
It's the feel that why you go. It's not the fact that there's a Caltex station there or something. It's the feel that you want to try and capture. And it's a huge country. It's bigger than France by 5 or 10%. Yeah. And France has 65 million people and Botswana has 2. So it's uninhabited for the most part, which allows bad people to do all sorts of things.
But Botswana has a more functional government than many other countries in Africa. It's been pretty stable.
It has,
all along, and it's on the parliamentary, isn't it, on the British model?
Yes.
Right. So it's and they also, because the river, the Okavango, is where most of the big African safari lodges and all. It's a huge tourism industry pumping money in Botswana.
It also has the 2 richest diamond mines in the world. And
More than the Kimberley mine now? Is that one pretty played out?
that's pretty played out, yeah.
Okay.
So Zwaneng and Orapa are the 2 biggest, owned 50-50 by De Beers and by the government of Botswana. So the country benefits enormously from that. And Facets of Death, you can guess by the title, has something to do with diamonds. And Zwaneng in the south mines about 100,000 carats a day. And
I wonder if the world hasn't, enough appetite for diamonds to absorb that kind of output. Are they mostly industrial?
Zwaneng is mainly not industrial.
Not industrial.
Yeah, But of course, that 100,000 carats, once it's cut and everything, is much less. But needless to say, what happens in Facets of Death is those 100,000s get hijacked on the way to Gaborone.
Yeah. In other words, Botswana is richer than most of the African countries, and that contributes to its stability.
Right, very much so.
And what are the two languages? South English,
Setswana,
Setswana.
and then I don't think a Bushman language is part of the official languages. In South Africa, we have 11 official languages.
Right.
And that was part of the Bishop Tutu, Nelson Mandela quest to try and keep the country together after apartheid fell away, thank goodness. And English is the prime. English and Afrikaans are still very big. Zulu, Xhosa. But I think one of the Bushman languages is one of the official languages. And
Are you fluent in Afrikaans too, which is basically Dutch?
no, I mean, I used to speak it reasonably because you had to learn it in school.
Right.
But having been here for so long, speaking it is difficult. I can still understand a lot of it very easily.
There's a real accent. Actually, the English of South Africans. Yours not so much, but I've spoken to South Africans who are very strong.
Really? Have you really liked that?
Just noticed it. Yeah. Anyway, anything else? No?
I was curious about what you taught when you were a professor.
I was interested in how computers could be used for teaching and learning. So I got into that in the late 60s, actually. I was working at the University Computer Center in Johannesburg, and my boss was very interested in education and a very fine computer scientist. And he encouraged me to start playing around with that idea. And so I think it was in 1969, I wrote a computer program to teach first-year engineers a programming language called Fortran. And it was delivered on a teletype, not even a CRT. And I so enjoyed that process that I went to the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, which was really the only place in the world that had anything akin to a curriculum in that area. And so that's how I came to the States. And then they asked me to stay as an assistant professor there, and blah, blah, blah. And here I am.
Educational psychologist is what they actually call you.
Yeah.
Where Michael specialized in image processing and remote sensing and taught at the University of Witwatersrand.
Right. He's a mathematician by training.
How did you meet?
We met, I went back to South Africa in 1979. I was at Illinois at the time, but I took a year's leave of absence because a big computer company called Control Data had the marketing rights to a computer-based teaching system called Plato that had been developed at Illinois. And so they were marketing it around the world. And the Electricity Supply Commission of South Africa had bought the system. And they thought that a South African
to show them how to use
who
it,
knew something about this would be a good consultant.
Got it.
So I went there, and my office there was across the street from the University of the Witwatersrand, which is where I got my undergraduate as well. And I had a friend there and who was friendly with Michael. And so we sort of met then. What I didn't know at the time is that Michael did his mathematics sabbaticals in the University of Minnesota. And when I left the University of Illinois, because I didn't like the weather anymore, I went north to Minnesota. And
Well, it's even better.
it is much better. In winter, it's cold, but the snow stays there. In Illinois, it melts and freezes and melts and freezes. You know exactly what it is.
Sure, Minnesota's was more pure winter.
Yeah.
So
So
a series of happy coincidences.
So he came to Minnesota, and he probably doesn't like me saying this, but he wasn't a very good cook at that time. And I enjoyed cooking, so he would come over and we would eat and drink, and we found that we enjoyed many things together. We had the same interest in books and music and travel and wildlife and so on. And so we became good friends. And then when I went back to South Africa in the mid-80s, I was a private pilot, and I would rent a small plane and fill it with my friends, and we would go bird watching and game watching in Zimbabwe and Botswana. And it was on one of those trips that we saw a pack of hyenas hunt and kill a wildebeest, which then disappeared in 4 hours. And we said, if we want to get rid of a body, which is exactly the first chapter of A Carrion Death.
Great origin story. It really is. Well, thank you very much, Dan.
Well,
It's been
thank
wonderful
Barbara
to have
very
a
much
chance to
indeed, and
visit.
thank all of you. Thank you.
Thank our virtual audience for joining us. And we do have autographed copies of A Deadly Covenant and a few of the other books. So if you all like to get your books signed,
Yeah.
we will turn ourselves off here. And why don't you just stay there?
Okay.
That's an easy place for people to